Hi, Dan Ferris, editor of Extreme Value, published by Stansberry Research here. And today's video is inspired by the VIX. And the VIX is talked about a lot these days. And you don't really hear many people explaining what it is or what it means. And I'm willing to bet that most of the people watching this video don't know, which is okay. I certainly didn't until I looked into it a couple years ago in August and September of 2016, and just did a little studying and talked to a fellow named Russell Rhodes, who was I believe he's the director of educational programs at the CBOE, the exchange that kind of runs the VIX and publishes the VIX and calculates it and updates it every several minutes. And I learned a few things that I think are probably useful for you so that you understand what it means when the people in the news say, you know, the VIX is 15 or 20 or 30 today or whatever it is. So that's what we're going to talk about, the VIX. And we'll start just with a general idea. So the general idea is that the VIX is made up, it's the output of an equation, and the initial input is option prices, put and call options on the S&P 500, and they're more than 23 days out and less than 37 days out, and they average out to about 30 days. And you know, historically speaking, when the VIX is called the fear gauge, because when the S&P 500 falls, majority of the time, most of the time, when the S&P 500 falls, the VIX will rise. So we call it the fear gauge, right? Oh, the VIX is way up. That means investors are afraid. They're buying lots of put options. It causes the VIX to spike. And so people generally believe that, you know, the VIX will go up when the S&P 500 goes down. And that's pretty much right. In fact, it's right about 80% of the time. So it's not right 100% of the time. It's right about 80% of the time. That was one of the first things I learned from Russell Rhodes at the CBOE. And so it explains, you know, some days when you see the VIX and the market going in the same direction, the VIX and the S&P 500. If they're both going up, it's not that unusual, especially on small moves. So that's that. And, you know, actually, what is the VIX? Well, it's the output of a bunch of complicated math, really. You input about 150 or 200 options on the S&P 500, the options prices, and you know, so there's a group that's, you know, more than 23 days out, and there's a group that's less than 37 days out, and they kind of put these two groups together and they do a combined weighted average. And then they make that into a square root, multiply it by 100, and it really should have a percent next to it. That's the ultimate output that you see published. When the VIX is 15, it means 15%. It means the options market is looking out 30 days and thinks that there's a chance that the S&P 500 will rise or fall at a 15% annualized rate over the next 30 days. So then you know, if you want to get to the actual amount that the market thinks it will rise and fall, you can, you know, to get that monthly figure, you can just divide the VIX by the square root of 12, which is like 3.5 or something. And if it's 15, I wrote it down here because I wouldn't know it off the top of my head. You know, you divide by the square root of 12, and so basically at 15, the VIX says there's a 68% chance of the S&P 500 rising or falling by about 4.3% over the next month. 15 divided by about 3.5, 3.46 or something like that. And then you can do the same thing for a weekly calculation by dividing by the square root of 52, which is about 7.2. And at 15, you know, there's 68% chance of S&P 500 rising or falling by about 2.08% over the coming week. Or so the options market seems to be signaling. Obviously, the options market doesn't know the future. So that's really, that's what it is. When you see that number published, it's a belief that the S&P 500 is going to move at an annualized rate of whatever the VIX is over the next month. And it's not, it's a guess. It's almost like a sentiment indicator. This is what the sentiment in the options market thinks of the stock market. Human nature is such that when stocks fall, of course, people start to get scared, so they buy more put options, and the VIX spikes. I mean, it's just kind of obvious how these two things work together. An interesting fact about all of this, or an interesting aspect of it all, is that volatility, of course, is just up and down movements. Why is the VIX geared so much toward downward movements? Well, it's just because of the nature of equities. It's people mostly just let equity prices go where they're going to go, and they don't get too scared. But then when they fall, they start getting scared, so they buy a lot of put options, and it causes the VIX to spike. And in fact, there are volatility indexes on other assets, like oil, for example, that are published by the CBOE as well, and do in fact reflect volatility in whatever direction. So they function more as a pure volatility kind of indicator. And that's what the VIX is. It's the output of an equation that is the product of a bunch of inputs from the options market, options on the S&P 500 index. And it outputs this expectation that the market is going to move by some annualized rate over the next month. And that annualized rate is that VIX number that you see published every day. So that's what the VIX is, and I hope you'll keep that in mind as you see that number published. And I hope that the meaning of that number kind of helps you out a little bit and makes you realize that it's not a perfect thing. In fact, the VIX is not volatility. It's just a way of gauging volatility in the equity market, and the equity market as represented by the S&P 500. So it's all sort of as good as they can make it, but it's by no means perfect. So sometimes you'll see the VIX going up when the market is going up, and sometimes you'll see the VIX going down when the market is going down. But that usually doesn't happen. On the big moves down, you're highly likely, I believe, to see the VIX going up. So I hope that helps you understand the VIX a little bit more, and thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye-bye.